Okay, so we are going to continue on now talking with language, talking about English's relationship to other languages and how English becomes kind of this dominant global language that everyone is either knowing or at least is aware of, and how it became so dominant and so prevalent. So that's going to be kind of the thing we're going to focus on here for the next video or two. So as we mentioned previously, English is a part of that Indo-European language. It's considered a Germanic language, and then connects itself over into English when it becomes its own language, kind of over time. All right. So here's again our Indo-European, and then we also break out into the Germanic, and then into Western Germanic, and then English as a connection. But it also has a connection a little bit in with, well, not Proto-Celtic. We want to look for Romance languages with France. All right. And so I'm just going to kind of breeze through this. Within the hypothesis of the origin and diffusion of Indo-European languages. Essentially, there's a thought about, how all these languages are combined, where they come from, essentially sparking out of around southern Russia, or, kind of where Turkey is within, this territory. And so essentially, it just kind of comes that either they were nomadic herders, kind of in the sense of where the Mongols are, the Mongol peoples, or Turkic people, they're nomadic herders, they're following their herds, and then they migrate in all directions in search of food, and that's kind of where the Indo-European languages come from. And then it explains, kind of this outward push, where all these languages at least have some sort of origin point, spreading, again, as a result, in search of food, following, their flocks of, sheep and other types of animals, going into Europe, the Middle East, India, and like that. The other thought is more of a sedentary farmer thought, and that's once agriculture became a thing, humans spread out to get more agricultural land, more places where they could grow crops, and then split off here and moving like that, and that's where the languages began. And that's kind of the two hypotheses. You might see a question or two on that within a unit test or on the AP exam itself. I wouldn't focus too much on them, just kind of know sedentary means you're sitting down farming. Nomadic warrior, you're moving following herds, and that's kind of the ideas of how the Indo-European languages might have spread. So remember that we talked about Indo-European languages are spoken by at least 50% of the world's population, and you can kind of see the biggest branches here. Indo-Iranian being here within India and Iran and Pakistan. So that would fall, so Farsi as a language, Afghani would fall under there. Russian, Polish, German, Italian, French, English all fall under those categories. And so you can kind of see, how these things kind of get written in there. Within the Indo-Iranian, there you have Farsi, but also Hindi is also within that group too. Balto-Slavic with the Cyrillic languages like, Russia and all those places. Cyrillic being the written language, the written letters and vocab. So yeah, now you can just kind of look at all that. And so there's kind of your breakdown of, your Iranian and Indic. And again, you don't have to know these in particular too much. At least you shouldn't have to. It's just kind of, if you really want to know about the language families, it's more about knowing the connection to Mandarin, with the Sino-Tibetan and how it gets to Mandarin, and then how Indo-European gets itself to English, following, the family, the branch, the group, all that stuff. So within English as itself, part of that Germanic branch and West Germanic language group, it's a combination of both German and French as a result of migrations and invasions of the actual Isles of England that begin. So the Germanic tribes come in there in the 5th century. Predominantly, we're talking, people from Germany, but also from, Sweden. And, this map down here kind of shows the time frame of that. The Vikings come in there kind of in the 8th century. And then also the invasion by the French in 1066 with Norman the Conqueror. Or is that William the Conqueror, who's a Norman? I don't remember specifically about that. But yeah, then English kind of builds on its own. And then because of that separation from France, but also from Germany, whoops, went the wrong way there. Apologize, I didn't mean to hit that quick. And so it then becomes a distributed language as a result of England becoming very, very powerful. It's people moving around the world for colonization, thinking about going to the Americas, but then also with the idea of imperialism, with, not necessarily conquering all this territory and moving settlers there, but just getting resources from those lands. So that would include India, South Africa, Egypt to an extent, Nigeria, Hong Kong would fall under that as well, and Singapore. and then Canada to a lesser extent. So it's considered a Germanic language because for the most part, most of the words, most of the vocabulary come from German, and then French gets infused there a little bit. So it's kind of a hybrid language, right? So within the Romance languages, again, the other part where the British or the English language is a little bit connected to, all comes from this idea of what we call Romance languages that are connected as a result of the Roman Empire. So Latin was the language of the Roman Empire, getting started here predominantly in Italy and in Rome, and diffused as a result of the Roman Empire. Right, as the Roman Empire expanded, you wanted people to at least have similar languages and similar understandings of the culture, and easily to communicate, to travel, to enforce laws, things like that, to trade. Having one singular language becomes really, really important with that. And so we got this term, Vulgar Latin, which was a form used by those under the rule of Rome. So people living in Gaul was what France was called, or within the Iberian Peninsula with Spain and Portugal, or Great Britain, or in Greece or Egypt, or Palestine, Israel. People would use Vulgar Latin, which was not the standard language. It was kind of a sort of unstandard, because again, people weren't being taught necessarily Latin, but they had to know it to be part of the empire, and to understand kind of what the soldiers are saying, what the tax people are saying, what the governments are saying, because the Roman Empire grows at various rates. This is the height of the Roman Empire in 117 CE, so about 1900 years ago. And the Roman Empire has built itself up over hundreds of years. So people are learning Latin at various points. Not everyone's going to have the same definitions, the same exact wording. Things are going to change over time, because it's still a massive empire, even when it is connected. And it takes several months to get from one end to the other throughout all that. So words change over time, how people say and understand certain words. Think about that also in terms of, Mexican Spanish versus, formal Spanish that you're taught in school is not the same as what people from Mexico are learning here, or from, if you are Mexican and speak Spanish versus, how we teach it here in the United States or how it's taught in Spain is very different in terms of, again, the language, the vocab, the syntax, and all that. So yeah. In some cases, also, Latin was also combined with local languages to make it easier to understand. We'll talk about that and how that connects to other stuff in another video. So eventually, as the Roman Empire collapses and trade kind of decreases, the Romance languages that formed out of Latin, or that started with Latin, begin to form their own languages as a result of isolation, which is natural. That's kind of why we have different words and different dialects between American English and British English, right? So that includes languages like Spanish, French, Italian, Portuguese as well, and then Romanian, because these are all big parts of the empire. But again, over time, because there's a big mountain range that separates Spain from France, as well as France from Italy, it helps to explain why there are subtle differences in the languages and the pronunciations, and why when you hear people talk in both French and in Italian, there are similar sounding words and similar things that have the slightest of differences. Just like between English and German, if you were to read, a really basic thing in English and in German, there's a lot of connections. Like red in English is rot in German, blau, blue, things like that. And then kind of over time they become, more different, especially as more words come up over time. So similar words that have always kind of existed within the languages have very big similarities, and words that develop independently within each country or within each region obviously sound very, very different. All right, so here's kind of your Romance language map, and you can kind of see all the different branches within that, at least within the Romance part. All right, so how this connects to the global dominance of English, and we're not going to be able to get through this in one video, but we are going to start it here. All right, so a lingua franca is something that a language that is used and understood in trade between people who have different native languages. All right, so it's a connecting language because there are just so many languages out there that it might just be easier to use a different language or a standard language to communicate trade. So French and Chinese businessmen may use English to do business and trade because it's easier for people in these other countries to connect those things, because most likely if you're a businessman from France and you're a businessman from China, you're still going to have to deal with people in English. And so English has kind of become that standard, and we want to help understand why English is one of the most dominant lingua francas out there, and how that relates. So Unfortunately, this kind of shows a cultural bias here. It's easier for countries like Guyana, Eritrea, and the Netherlands to learn English than for people in the US and the UK to learn their languages. So there is that kind of flip side that they're learning our language, but we're not necessarily learning their languages. And again, that comes back to the importance of a dominant culture, but also how impactful that is on trade. So yeah, and while we don't necessarily get the chance to do this year, in the past we've watched a number of movies in class, like The Visitor, where this guy he has an apartment in New York City, but he hardly ever travels there. Only when he's like a part-time professor, when he's not teaching at whatever northeastern school he's at. And he comes back to his apartment in New York City, that he lives there part-time, and he discovers two people living there illegally, and they thought they were living there legally. And so, yeah, they all speak English, but she speaks French. He speaks French, but they also speak Arabic. So they use French as kind of their main communicating language, or was it Arabic? I don't remember. And then another movie, really, really good movie that we've watched called Tangerines. It's about a conflict in Georgia, or not in the state of Georgia, but in the country of Georgia, south of Russia, where you have people from Estonia, which is way far away from there, people from the Caucasus and Azerbaijan, whole bunch of different groups located there, and they're all speaking Russian as the lingua franca because otherwise, they're speaking in these various, different languages that they wouldn't understand. And because the whole movie is in a foreign languages, we're all assuming that they're all talking to the same language. They're not. They're all speaking in their different areas when they're talking to their specific people, and they bring back and talk in Russian when it comes to that point, or I think maybe Georgian. Either way, it brings that whole piece of, why we have certain languages that we use for trade. So English is the most dominant one as a result of, going back to Great Britain, colonialism and imperialism. They were the biggest dominant trading force in the globe, had the biggest navy. Most trade was conducted in their territories that way when they were in control of India. Had big trading ports within China, within the United States, and then, obviously that adds to it as well. And then you also have the stuff related to World War II and the Cold War, all the big companies that have come out of the United States as a result, and how the United States dominates or has dominated trade for the last 70-odd years. Especially our culture. Think about the movies we make, the popular culture we put out, as well as that from Great Britain, and that kind of helps to explain why we are the biggest lingua franca. So a Pidgin language, Pidgin, not Pigden, is a simplified lingua franca. So these are, where you take parts of different languages to make it more easy to communicate in use of a few grammar rules. It's not as structurally sound in order to facilitate better communication between these different groups. So the official language of Papua New Guinea is one, and they don't actually list it here, but it's made up of English, Spanish, German, and Papuan words, while Swahili is a Pidgin language that's a mixture of Arabic and Bantu languages on the eastern coast of Africa. So I do have a quick thing I'm going to read here, so you can kind of see this on the screen, about the evolution of Pidgin languages. So yeah, sound like a broken variation of more commonly spoken languages, is that they are using slang. It's not. Because they aren't. All right, they are grown out of necessity when groups of people that don't share a common language must interact with each other, similarly like a lingua franca. So it's a mixture of words of different languages and have simpler grammatical structure and smaller vocabulary to make it easier to just communicate rather than having full sentences, and becomes a common, and over time becomes a common mode of communication. All right. Pidgins are usually secondary languages used in specific scenarios and groups like trade for that, while a primary language like French or English is more frequently used. And so this will tie itself into Creole later on. So yeah, examples of Pidgin languages. Hawaii fits in there very, very well. So examples of Pidgin English within Hawaii are these kind of things like right here. So again, makes it a lot easier, and that's why people misconstrue it with slang, is because it's just, a lot easier and simplified in that terminology. So we are going to stop here, bring back the term of lingua franca within the global definition of English and how English has continued to be a dominant language.